So the first thing that we need to do in implementing our narrative research method, and this is only specifically to narrative research, this is for any research, is to select our subjects appropriately. Okay. The next is we want to make sure that we collect our data. And data collection in narrative research and qualitative research takes many forms. I'll do a more in-depth analysis later in the series on various forms of data collection, various forms of data interpretation. Data collection primarily, and I think I talked about this in a little bit, data collection usually takes the form of journaling, documenting what the participant is saying. I used the combination in my dissertation of journaling, but I also recorded the audio and had that audio transcribed, and I'll talk more about that later as well. So you want to make sure that you collect the data. Number 3, you want to report your findings. Right? This is where most of the writing part, the aspect of your research where you incorporate theory to what was said from the answers that your participants gave you, right? You'll look, and in your instructors will help guide this, but based on what was said, the participants' life experience best represents this, and then you sort of apply. Let me give you another example so that I don't get you lost. In Jamaica, post-colonial theory is extremely applicable because Jamaica was a former colony. And there is a very, very sort of regimented, hierarchical, oppressive sort of bias in Jamaican culture in a current situation. You know, you have red-skinned Jamaicans, dark-skinned Jamaicans, sort of like in the American South. There's that mentality in Jamaica as well. If I were to interview a number of people, maybe 2 or 3 people, who experienced these acts of discrimination through their lived experience as young Jamaican children, adolescents, and adults, what you recognize is there comes a point at which, in reporting my findings, I'm going to need a theoretical scope to frame their responses, right? So that they're giving me information, I collect this information, this data is collected, and then I need a means in which I can analyze this information, right? Anytime we're talking about reporting our findings, what we're going to recognize is we're going to need a theoretical framework. For example, the example that I just gave, post-colonial theory as a framework might be the best. If you're interviewing a woman who fought for women's rights, for civil rights, you might use a feminist framework, and so on and so on and so forth. Depending on what the participant is disclosing to you, you'll be able to select from a framework that best interprets that information. Now, what you'll recognize is that there are 2 different schools of thought, primarily. You have a school of thought where you have the participant, right, and the participant disclose some data, right, and we'll just call this data X, right? So the participant disclosed data. There's one school of thought that says there's a theory, right, there's a theory, and that theory applies to the data. So the data is there, and we take the theory, and like in a cookie cutter sense, we sort of apply the theory to the data to form the data into, into a suitable structure. So if my account is going to be a post-colonial, if I'm going to use narrative research to articulate the experience of Jamaicans within a post-colonial framework, then I'm going to have to make sure that what they say I interpret within the vein of post-colonial theory. There's another, and I'll talk about this in maybe in many videos from now, but in the section on grounded theory functions in a different sense, right? And I don't want to jump the gun because I'll talk about this in more detail then. In grounded theory, the participants disclose information. That information becomes my data. And from that data, the data creates the theory. T-H-E-O-R-Y, if I could write. All right? So you have 2 different approaches. One approach where the theory is applied to the data to shape the data. Another where the data is the foundation for creating a theory. this narrative theory is more, not narrative theory, sorry, narrative research is more of the former, right? In narrative research, what we're doing is we're applying a theoretical framework to the data that we received from our participant, and that theoretical framework can take the form of, you know, whatever framework your instructors feel is best, your professors, your committee members feel is best to shape the narrative account that you receive from your participants. So reporting the findings, very important, and in this report we're going to need to shape the data that we've received within appropriate theoretical framework. And then lastly, for a description of meaning. Within a description of meaning, this is not only for, and as I said, these aren't exclusively for narrative research, but in narrative research it applies. This description of meaning applies to all of the 6 forms of qualitative research that I'm going to do in these series of videos. A description of meaning is key. It is key. It is what we're looking for. As a hard scientist is looking for some laws, as the hard scientist is looking for facts of the matter, right? Something which can be reproduced and identified as factually valid as the sort of the end state of his or her research agenda. The social scientist, when the social scientist is doing it best, wants to have a better understanding of meaning, the significance of the story that I was told, right? A participant told me this story, and the reason why I needed to understand this story is because this story had meaning. And sometimes the meaning of the story isn't as accessible as you think. In a little bit, I'll give you a little bit more insight into this description of meaning. This description of meaning isn't as accessible, if you will, to students unless the students have very, very deliberate training in how to understand and interpret meaning from what participants say. Because you have to recognize that the significance and the meaning of their lived experience, of the participant's lived experience, might not be readily apparent to the participant, him or herself. Okay, what in the world does that mean? Okay, imagine the following scenario. Imagine that I am a young mother. I'm a young mother, and I have a young single mother, and I don't have anyone to help me raise my children. I know that life is hard. I know that times are rough, but I go about my daily routine. I wake up, I take my kids to school, I go to work, I do all of this, and I do this for my life. I do this for my life. And for whatever reason, you selected this category, this, not really category, but this social demographic type as the focus of your research, you know, single women, ... And you're interviewing the woman and you say, hey, has it ever occurred to you that your sacrifice, what you were doing, was a condition to make your child's life better? And they say, oh yeah, sure. And as you get deeper and deeper into the account, it's invariably the case, if you create, and I'll talk about discursive space in a second, if you create the appropriate discursive space, that, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, that you'll eventually reach a point where the individual telling the story, the woman telling the story, comes about a recognition of her own experience that she never had prior to this interview. This happens all the time, right? So for example, it might be the case that an individual says, you know, I never really realized until now just how much work I put in after all those years. I never really, it's not until I talk to you. Let's say you ask the person, you know, how much money do you think you spent? This is a pretty bad interview question, but this is just an example. How much money do you think you spent in raising your children from the time of their birth until the time they left? And you sort of go through and you do the math, and let's say the number is something ridiculous, like, $1.3 million. The person's gonna be like, I can't believe it was that much money. Knowing how much time it took to make, right? There's a new sense of meaning, right? There's a new description of meaning, right? I recognize as the participant and also the researcher just how much labor, right? Just how much sacrifice was appropriated by this woman in order for her children to be successful, in order to get them from state A to state B, right? This is when research is done really, really well. What you recognize as both the researcher and the participant is you create a situation in which meaning can be identified, meaning can be disclosed, and this is only possible, and that's the next point in this, right? This description of meaning is only possible when there is a true dialectical exchange between the participant and the researcher, right? So this description of meaning requires right? Conversation, dialogue is the currency of qualitative research. It really is. After you have your data collected and transcribed, then you can do many, many things with it, but you need to engage the participant. And it's very important that the participant feels that you care about their story and that you have a platform in which their story can help change, for the better, the lives of people who have suffered, or make clear those who might not understand, create a foundation in which more people have access to their story. Alright, so that is the first half, right? In talking about narrative research, the first use of narrative research is as a method of research, and it unfolds generally in this sense, right? We're going to select our subjects, we're going to collect our data, we're going to report our findings, and then we're going to describe the meaning, the significance of what we found, right? And that's pretty generic. As I said, this is not exclusive to narrative research, but this is almost a model, for the most part, for most, if not all, of the qualitative methods of research. All right.